Welcome to this episode of our podcast on Monarchy in Peril. I'm Robert Aldrich, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Sydney.
And I'm Cindy McCreary, an Associate Professor of History at the University of Sydney and Director of the Modern Monarchy in Global Perspective Research Hub.
The subject for this podcast is scandal. Everyone loves a good scandal, and scandals seem to punctuate royal history. They concern the incompetence of monarchs. Sometimes they even concern the impotence of monarchs or the legitimacy of royal birth. They circle around corruption. They concern the wealth of monarchs and royal families and the way that that money is spent and sometimes given to relatives of favorites. They're also about the abuse of power. Many scandals relate to the private life of these most public of figures. Let's think for a moment about Harry and Meghan. Whether you like them or not, it's hard to ignore them. The fact that Harry married a commoner rather than a royal was no longer a scandal. That is quite common now. But the fact that she was an American and that she was of mixed racial background did cause eyebrows to be raised. And then there was their move from the UK to the US. Certainly unexpected and something that didn't sit well with many. Then there were the tell-all interviews in Harry's almost tell-all book, which attracted attention, gossip, news reports, but also serious reflection about what it all meant. For some commentators, Harry and Meghan's behavior was in many ways perfectly acceptable. It was indeed a refreshing, welcome challenge and rejection of the stuffiness, the secrecy, the strictures of the British royal family. For others, however, Harry and Meghan might have appeared derelict in their duty. They might have seemed publicity seekers, young couple who were willing to sell their stories to the media and profit from their celebrity. They looked to some as, despite their privileges and their wealth, two people who wanted to portray themselves as victims of the British royal family, victims of the press, and victims of the public. Perhaps the scandal was not so much their actions as such, but the way that those actions, no matter what your point of view is, break with the conventions, the traditional obligations, the expectations of those who are born into royal families at the present time. We know about Harry and Meghan, but scandals are not just the prerogative of the British royals. Indeed, there are skeletons in the closet of most royal families. We mentioned in our first podcast the case of one involving the Belgian royal family. Former King Albert II of the Belgians was sued by a woman who said that she was his daughter by his mistress. And keep in mind that the king was married and is the monarch of a largely Catholic country. It took a court case for the king to be forced to acknowledge his paternity of Delphine and for her to gain a royal title and formal membership of the royal family. And in this case, in Belgium, and it shows how complicated these scandals are, the real scandal was probably not so much the fact that a former king had a mistress and had a daughter with that mistress, but the fact that for so long he stoutly denied that parentage and rejected his biological daughter. There's been another scandal that concerns the king, or former king now, of Spain, King Juan Carlos. He has been a hero to the Spanish for the way in which he restored democracy in the 1970s after the death of Franco. But a few years ago, he abdicated his throne after a series of scandals. One involved an exorbitantly expensive hunting trip to Africa. The problem was not just that he was engaging in big game hunting, which many people now think is not a good thing, but that hunting trip had cost an exorbitant amount of money. And it took place at a time of a deep recession in Spain. Many of the king's subjects, his compatriots, were doing it tough in the midst of hard economic times. And there he was off in Africa shooting wild game. Subsequently, it was revealed that King Juan Carlos had a mistress and that he had given her something like 65 million euros, far from an inconsequential sum. And to add to all of that, she has now sued him, alleging harassment and perhaps threats. Yet another problem for Juan Carlos was that one of his sons-in-law was charged and convicted for financial improprieties. And that man and his wife, that is the king's daughter, were deprived of some of their titles. So, scandal everywhere. But the Belgian and Spanish dynasties have survived these scandals and indeed retain a great popularity. The current holders of the thrones in Brussels and Madrid are no doubt on their best behavior. Such royal scandals as have occurred in recent times in Britain, in Belgium, in Spain are nothing new. We'd like to look now at one of the biggest modern royal scandals, one that took place in Britain in the 1930s and that concerned King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, a woman who would become his wife. To discuss this affair with some very new perspectives, I'm joined by my colleague Cindy McCreary, who is a specialist on the history of Britain and its royal family. So, Cindy, why was the affair between Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson such a great scandal that it brought about the abdication of the king?
Well, Robert, you're absolutely right to focus on this scandal because Edward VIII's proposed marriage with Wallis Simpson not only brought about the end of his reign as King of Great Britain, but it almost brought down the government, and it led to an outpouring of shock and scandal and indeed trauma, not just in Great Britain, but around the world.
Edward VIII was not just king, but he was head of the Church of England, a church that didn't really accept divorce. So how do those two things play out?
We have to remember that in 1936, Great Britain was a very different nation, and indeed society in general is very different from that today. Divorce was seen as deeply traumatic and scandalous, and you're absolutely right that as the head of the Church of England, Edward was seen not just as the monarch, but as a spiritual and moral leader of the nation. So for the king to propose to marry a woman who was divorced not simply once but twice, as Wallis Simpson was seen as literally heretical. It didn't seem to be compatible for the King of England to marry a divorcee. And there was another count against Wallis Simpson, one that Meghan Markle might point to today, and that is that Wallis Simpson was an American, a well-off, well-dressed, quite flashy American socialite, and many people in Britain took against her almost immediately.
Didn't the British know that Edward was already something of a Lothario, or that he had certainly strayed from the straight and narrow path long before this?
Well, Edward certainly had a very lively romantic history, but it's dubious that many people in Britain, or at least many ordinary people, were aware of this. We need to remember that in this period, press kept the royal private lives incredibly private, and the press were very respectful of the British royal family. But you're right, Edward, in fact, had 3 very intense, long-running relationships with married women, including older married women, and Wallis Simpson was simply the third. There was Freda Dudley Ward, wife of a Liberal MP. There was Thelma Furness, actually another American, but married to a British aristocrat. And interestingly, she was the great aunt of CNN's anchor Anderson Cooper. She was a twin sister of Anderson Cooper's mother, Gloria Vanderbilt. The point with Wallis Simpson was that all of a sudden, Edward was going beyond what was seen as acceptable. In other words, it was acceptable for royal men to have affairs with women, even married women. What was not acceptable was for them to propose marriage to one of them, and for that woman, in due course, to then become the queen.
So there's an interesting gender angle here as well. Royal men have certain rights and privileges, but there are limits to that.
Absolutely. The sexual double standard is alive and well in 1930s Britain, as Wallis Simpson and many other women, for that matter, all too painfully found out.
The scandal about Edward and Wallis was a British scandal, but it also had international resonance. It was covered in newspapers around the world. Various people sympathized with one or the other. I think this is a new perspective. So tell us a little bit more about this and Edward's engagement with some of the realms that he reigned over. After all, he was Emperor of India and reigned over many countries in the world, including Australia.
We need to remember that Edward had become a global figure through his own global voyages in the aftermath of World War I, when his father, George V, sent him out to thank members of the Commonwealth, places like Australia and New Zealand, but also India, and thank them in particular for their service to the Allies in World War I. And through those royal tours, Edward became an incredibly popular royal and a global public figure. By the time he is facing this crisis in 1936, he's incredibly well known, not just in Britain, but in around the dominions of Great Britain, and indeed around the world. So he's this very famous, very handsome public figure. So this is a moment of crisis that involves not just people in Great Britain or the government of Great Britain. It involves the governments and the populations of the Dominion. So you have people writing to newspapers, not just in Britain, but in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand and elsewhere, giving their 2 cents worth on what they think Edward should do. It's really quite an extraordinary moment when monarchy becomes something for public discussion.
Do you think that some of the governments of the Commonwealth countries were more concerned than the British government?
We know, in fact, that both public opinion but also government opinion in places like Australia was much harsher in their view on Wallis Simpson and really felt very strongly that Edward must not marry her. There was very little sympathy for the relationship there. Whereas at home in Britain, interestingly, surviving letters indicate that many people, including many women, had a lot of sympathy for Edward's position and felt that true love should win out and that the couple should be allowed to marry with relatively little fuss. So it's interesting that it's in the colonies, not in Great Britain, where there's most concern and anger about Edward's relationship with Wallis and the proposed marriage.
And am I right that the scandal first broke in the US, which was, of course, Wallis's home nation? So it's not just in the Commonwealth, it's much beyond that there's that debate and discussion.
This absolutely becomes a global news story. And you're quite right, Robert. What's really interesting to look at is the very different relationships of world media organizations to this episode and in general to the British royal family. In Britain and the colonies, there is a great sense of self-censorship. The press will not publish material about Edward's affair with Wallis until it becomes public knowledge, very late in 1936. But months before then, even from as early as the Northern Hemisphere summer of 1936, both American newspapers and continental European newspapers, which didn't have the same sense of deference to the British royal family, were openly discussing the relationship between Edward and Wallis and discussing the possibility of marriage. So it hits the British public and the colonial public harder because they find all this out very late in the day. And the news of the affair, while there have been rumors about it, isn't confirmed till late in that year, followed very quickly by discussion about a possible abdication. So it is a tremendous shock for people in Britain and around the British colonies.
You're listening to Monarchy in Peril from the Modern Monarchy in Global Perspective Research Hub at the University of Sydney. Edward and Wallis did finally marry after he abdicated. What happened then? Did they continue to be a subject of scandal?
I think that for many people in Britain, Edward and Wallis simply disappear. And it's very evident that the new king, George VI, and in particular his mother, Queen Mary, is determined that the public in Britain and the Commonwealth see and recognize the authority of the new king. So they go overboard to show Queen Mary's support for the king. And so very unusually in British coronation history, the Dowager Queen, Queen Mary, that is the widow of the previous King George V, attends the coronation of her son, George VI, in a show of support for the new monarch. And interestingly, in order to save money and hassle, George VI is actually crowned in a coronation ceremony that had been planned for his elder brother, Edward VIII. So while Edward VIII was the monarch, he's only monarch for a year, and that wasn't enough time to actually hold the coronation. So George VI actually nabs Edward VIII's coronation date, and the service is conducted in the fashion that had been designed for Edward VIII. But Wallis and Edward don't completely disappear. They have some small roles working for the British government. Edward VIII is the wartime governor of the Bahamas during World War II. But they spend the most of the remaining years of their life, and they both live to a fairly old age, mostly in France, where they do attract some supporters and friends. But they are very limited in their relationship with the British family, and quite poignantly, Edward VIII watches the coronation of his niece, Elizabeth, in 1953, not as a member of the family in Westminster Abbey, but with a group of friends and Wallis in France on television.
That's a wonderful image of Edward and Wallis sitting in their French house looking at the ceremony on television. Edward lost his throne, but he and his wife, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they became, still maintained their celebrity status right down until their dying day, didn't they? And even afterwards, when Wallis's jewels and some other possessions were auctioned off. So it's interesting how former monarchs can remain in the public eye.
Indeed, and I think as well, Robert, that they didn't totally disappear from the memory of members of the British royal family. And indeed, after Wallis's death, there was information that Queen Elizabeth, in fact, had shed a tear at news not just of her uncle's death, but also of her aunt's death, the Duchess of Windsor. So I think that there was a lot of not just trauma and sadness, but still a sense of family relationships that were important. And indeed, before the abdication, it was very evident that Edward, who recognized that Elizabeth, his brother's eldest daughter, would one day be monarch, had a very warm relationship with his niece, and that in some ways he was seen as almost guiding her in her future role as monarch. So there is something, I think, quite poignant about the abdication, and I think it's something that not only shocked the world, but also it deeply traumatized members of the family itself. And it's probably a good moment to realize and remember that these are, after all, families. These are family members and who feel pain and loss and regret, just like the rest of us.
That's a very good reminder that what we're talking about here is a family affair. They are a royal family, but also a family, and the relations between Edward and Elizabeth are those not just between a once king and a future queen, but between an uncle and a niece, and a family that shares memories and interests and blood ties. You've talked a lot about the reportage of the affair in the press at the time, both in Britain and elsewhere, around the world, in fact. These days, most people are familiar with the British royal family through the Netflix series The Crown, which of course has been through a number of different series covering decades in the history of the family, and it's been watched by audiences of millions. As a historian, what do you think about that dramatization?
I have such mixed feelings about the Netflix series, The Crown. On the one hand, I think it's important to understand that this is how most people today get their history of the British royal family. And I think as a historian, I have to welcome that because it means more people are interested in asking questions about British royal history. But at the same time, I am torn because The Crown is absolutely fascinating, but we have to remember that it's a fictional account. And we also have to remember that royal figures in general, not always, but in general, don't really have a right of reply, certainly not reigning monarchs, so that we don't have, for example, King Charles III, or indeed his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, able to comment on episodes of The Crown and point out where the producers got things wrong. So we need to remember that the dialogue is largely made up, that some of the scenes never actually took place. On the other hand, I think that The Crown does evoke a lot of the sentiment, not just of the individual royals involved, but of the larger social context in which this history took place. And I think from that perspective, it can be a helpful way for us to think about, for example, the real trauma that the abdication of Edward VIII and his relationship with Wallis Simpson created in Britain. So I think it can get across that kind of drama quite well. I did say that reigning monarchs don't really have the right to reply, but I think this is a good moment to realise that former monarchs sometimes can. And Edward VIII is a good example. Very unusually for a member of the royal family, he did actually publish a memoir called A King's Story. Now, it wasn't really full of many illuminating tidbits, but it did put his case and the case of his wife as to why, in his view, the decision for them to marry and for him to abdicate from the British throne was a sensible one. So it did give this royal an opportunity to set the record straight.
Well, there you have a good examination question. Compare Edward VIII's memoir with Prince Harry's memoir. This scandal in the 1930s is really the important one, not just for the British monarchy, but because of its echoes, I think, for others as well. Some may have even been a bit afraid of their own skeletons tumbling out. One final question for you. Given that there have been so many scandals in the British royal family, going back even to the time of Edward VII and extending down to those involving people like Prince Andrew, does the dynasty, or how has the dynasty weathered those scandals relatively unscathed?
That's a great question and a complex one. I think we need to distinguish here between the way the institution has responded and the way that individuals have responded. And although we can say that the institution has survived, it's clear, at least metaphorically, that not all individuals have survived, or at least not survived in maintaining their initial roles. For example, Edward VIII had to abdicate the throne, even if the British royal family, the British monarchy, survived. I think there are three strategies that the British royal family have used to weather these scandals. One is simply silence and secrecy. I think we need to remember that for much of 1936, the British royal family and the British government was absolutely determined to keep news of Edward VIII's relationship with Wallis Simpson secret. And as we've seen, British and colonial newspapers absolutely towed the line and did not, by and large, disclose details of their relationship, even though American and continental European newspapers did. At the same time, as well as that public silence, I think there's also behind-the-scenes negotiations. There was a lot of high-level consultations involving not just courtiers and members of the royal family, but actually members of the British government. Winston Churchill, for example, who was really quite sympathetic to Edward VIII, did a lot of negotiating to try and sort out some kind of solution between Edward VIII and the British government. But the third, and this is perhaps the most controversial tactic or strategy that the British royal family uses, is the willingness from time to time to identify and, if you like, sacrifice a royal scapegoat to limit the damage to the larger institution. Now, Edward VIII might be seen as one clear-cut example. He abdicates the throne and really lives in exile for the rest of his life. Arguably, Prince Andrew and Prince Harry are other examples because they have to be cast publicly as villains in order for the heirs or the future monarch or current monarchs, namely Charles and William in the British case, to remain heroes in the public imagination. And the possibility for public rehabilitation can be very difficult. It's not impossible, however. I think we need to remember that Camilla, who of course began her public role as, if you like, Charles's mistress, has now really been widely rehabilitated in the public imagination. And if she is not as beloved as Charles's first wife, Diana, was, for many people in and beyond Britain, Camilla is now seen as broadly respectable and is seen as an appropriate person to be the British consort in a way that previous royal mistress, Wallis Simpson, never could be.
So an interesting trajectory of rehabilitation and prestige for some, though not for all of them. Thank you so much for these insights about the public and the private nature of that scandal, but also its wider repercussions and how it echoes earlier scandals and later scandals. I think it tells us a lot about the monarchy as institution, but the monarchy as a set of individuals. It also tells us a lot about how the monarchy is perceived in the press and in the public. Ironically, such scandals evoke more interest in the monarchy when people's interest has waned, and perhaps even more sympathy for individuals who are involved in what are, after all, very real dramas, as you were saying, Cindy, sometimes with happy endings and sometimes with not such happy endings. The royals, as various people say, in some ways are like the rest of us, despite their palaces and jewels and all the rest. And families have to safeguard reputations. And I think you would agree with me that for the royal family, a royal family, the priority is the institution.
As many people describe the British royal family today, it's known as the firm. And the firm must survive no matter what the cost to individual members.
Cindy, thank you. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please join us for the next one, when our subject will be assassinations. This series of podcasts has been created by the Modern Monarchy in Global Perspective Research Hub at the University of Sydney. Please see our website for further information at global-monarchy.sydney.edu.au. The text of the podcast were written by Associate Professor Cindy McCreary and Professor Emeritus Robert Aldrich. And the series was produced by Peter Adams from the University of Sydney School of Humanities. The podcasts are copyright by the University of Sydney, and the authors and interviewees retain rights to their material. We acknowledge the Indigenous Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Sydney stands.